Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Reiter. I'm serving as the moderator of today's session, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the afternoon session of the 2021 Association for Documentary Editing annual meeting. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce this afternoon's panel, which is titled Digital Strategy for Archival Materials Related to the Education of People with Blindness and Deafblindness. Our panelists are Jen Hale, serves as the lead archivist at the Perkins School for the Blind. She's presented topics on topics widely related to issues associated with accessibility of photographs and digital collections, as well as ethical issues related to digitization. And our second panelist is Molly Stothert-Maurer, currently serves as associate librarian and head of the library and archives at the Arizona State Museum, and formerly served as archivist at the Perkins School for the Blind. So our outline for today's session is our colleagues have recorded their presentation, which we'll collectively view. And then at the end, we'll sort of transition from there into an interactive Q&A. And before we continue with their presentation, two logistical points. First, just a reminder that the session is being recorded. And you'll note it at the bottom of the Zoom window, a Q&A icon where you can enter your questions there and comments, and which we'll discuss in the Q&A. But again, thank you very much, Molly and Jen, for taking the time to share your work with us, and we look forward to learning from you. And I'll let you both, we'll proceed to the recording.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's talk on digital strategy for archival material related to the education of people with blindness and deafblindness, and specifically for collections at the Perkins School for the Blind. My name is Molly Stothert-Maurer, and I'm co-presenting with Jen Hale. We are pre-recording this session, but we'll join you live for a Q&A at the end. So today we will begin by introducing ourselves and the Perkins organization. We will talk about Perkins history, including important figures and students at the school. We'll describe the archival program and talk a bit about the other libraries and museums on campus. Then we'll do a bit of a deep dive into the history of reading and writing materials for the blind. Next, we'll discuss digital strategy and program design, efforts to make digital content accessible, and end with our transcription work and use of Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's talk on digital strategy for archival material related to the education of people with blindness and deafblindness, and specifically for collections at the Perkins School for the Blind. My name is Molly Stothert-Maurer, and I'm co-presenting with Jen Hale. We are pre-recording this session, but we'll join you live for a Q&A at the end. So today we will begin by introducing ourselves and the Perkins organization. We will talk about Perkins history, including important figures and students at the school. We'll describe the archival program and talk a bit about the other libraries and museums on campus. Then we'll do a bit of a deep dive into the history of reading and writing materials for the blind. Next, we'll discuss digital strategy and program design, efforts to make digital content accessible, and end with our transcription work and use of volunteers. So please keep in mind that our perspective is through the lens of archivists and that we are sort of documentary editing curious and only just familiarizing ourselves with your organization and perspective. So Jen Hale is the lead archivist at the Perkins School for the Blind, and I am the former archivist at Perkins and currently associate librarian and archivist at the Arizona State Museum. Jen is joining us from Somerville, Massachusetts, and I'm over here in sunny Tucson. So I would like to thank my colleague Gail Brenneman for encouraging us to speak to your group today.
Hi, it's Jen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Perkins School for the Blind. We are located in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is in the greater Boston area. We are a school that teaches children on campus, but also supports students and teachers in public schools across the US. Annually, we serve about 200 students on campus and 1,200 more in community programs. But we are much more than a school, and we have several other divisions. There is Perkins International, which works to put children with visual impairment and multiple disabilities in school. This is a global program, and it works to support children to learn and thrive and to equip adults to teach and make education accessible. Perkins Solutions deploys technology to overcome accessibility barriers. They are the home to Perkins Braille, and they are now offering digital accessibility consulting through Perkins Access, which is helping clients ensure that the online world is open to everybody. And finally, the Perkins Library has provided accessible reading material to people with visual impairments and other disabilities since 1837, and today they distribute more than 500,000 accessible books, magazines, newspapers, DVDs, and more at no cost to an estimated 28,000 patrons annually. So this is a photograph of the campus in Watertown that showcases the architecture, lots of green landscaping, and Boston off in the background. Next. So now we're going to touch on some of the history of Perkins in order to provide some context for what we'll be talking about. And this is a photograph of the old Perkins campus, which was formerly an old hotel in South Boston. And this was taken around 1906. Next. So our story begins when an aspiring physician named John Dix Fisher is in medical school and he's studying in Paris, and he visits the National Institution for Blind Youth. And this is a school founded in 1784 by Valentine Way, and it is the first of its kind in the world. Fisher visits, his visit occurs around 1825 to 1826, which is at a time when Louis Braille would have been a student or a teaching assistant there. Fisher is very moved by what he sees and is determined that the United States and Boston in particular should also house such a school. So when he gets back to US, he gets a group of important and interested Bostonians behind him, and the result is that in 1829, the first school for students who are blind in the United States is chartered in Boston. So Fisher now asks an old friend, Samuel Gridley Howe, to serve as director in 1831, and he accepts, and Howe is tasked with going abroad to get resources and learn from schools that serve students with blindness in Europe. So in 1832, he's got books, teaching materials, he's got 2 teachers, one from Paris and one from Edinburgh, and he's got his father's house to serve as a school. So the doors finally open to the first students, which are 6 in total, ages 6 to 23. And this is a painting on the left of Samuel Gridley Howe in 1833 at the age of 30. Next. So the early years at Perkins were really focused on advocating locally and nationally. This is a time when popular opinion held that blindness meant a lack of intellect. So the case for educating students was a large part of student selection, student and school activities. So in the photograph to the left is a portrait daguerreotype of Sophia Carter and her pupil, Charles Coddington, from around 1845. Carter was one of Howe's first pupils at Perkins, and Sophia and her sister Abigail toured the US in 1841 with Howe, demonstrating their skills and their knowledge. And the tour advocated for support and funding for the creation of schools, as well as books for the blind. So Sophia later worked at the school as an assistant teacher. So part of this is teaching students to be productive members of society and to hold jobs. And it's also proving that that's possible. It's also about acquiring educational materials. So we need books, writing tools, tactile educational materials, and these are not available or supplies are very expensive. So There's a lot of innovating. Perkins does collect materials from schools in Europe, which is a big part of our collection. There are also modifications made to traditional materials. So, maps are glued onto board and cut apart so they can be tactile. There's a lot of experimentation and ingenuity, and a lot of inventing of new techniques and experimentation. So for instance, Howe isn't satisfied with embossed writing systems in Europe and develops his own embossed alphabet called Boston Line Type, which we'll talk more about. Stephen Preston Ruggles is hired to design and build a printing press, and 7 titles are printed in 1835. So this is an enormous amount happening between collecting and making and proving the value of education for students who are blind. Next. Then comes Laura Bridgman. So at the age of 24 months, she fell ill with scarlet fever. She lost her sight, hearing, sense of smell, and nearly all of her taste. She comes to Perkins in 1837, just shy of 8 years old, and she becomes the first person to be formally educated with deafblindness. Howe publishes accounts of her education, and they both become internationally famous, and she is Helen Keller 50 years before Helen Keller. And this daguerreotype portrait of Laura Bridgman and her teacher, Sarah White, from around 1845 shows White finger spelling with Bridgman's hands. Next. Just a few highlights from the 19th century. In 1839, the school moves to an old hotel to meet demands. The school is constantly growing. It's very hard to meet all the demand for students. In 1842, Charles Dickens visits Perkins and documents Howe's work with Bridgman in American Notes. And that is a book Kate Keller, Helen Keller's mother, would read, and that would play an important part in her education and letting them know that she could be educated. In 1841, Howe Press is established to emboss books, and this is not just for the school, but supplied nationally. Boston Line Type was a standard for much of the 19th century in the United States. And in 1887, the first kindergarten for students who are blind opens. And this is a photograph of a scene of a kindergarten classroom that was exhibited at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Next. So also of note in the schools is the school's relationship with Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller. So Sullivan came to Perkins as a student in the fall of 1880. She befriends former student Laura Bridgman, who teaches her the manual alphabet. Sullivan graduates in 1886 class valedictorian, and she goes to Alabama to teach Helen Keller. Keller and Sullivan come to Perkins, where Keller is a student from 1888 to 1891. And this is a portrait of Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller from around 1887. It also shows a teacher and a student who is deafblind fingerspelling. Next. Some 20th century highlights. In 1912, a new campus is designed and built in Watertown, Massachusetts, where we are now located, with the express purpose of being accessible to students with blindness. So it's designed specifically architecturally with that in mind. In 1932, a separate deafblind department is created. In 1951, the first Perkins braille is designed and produced by David Abraham at Howe Press. It's not the first brailler, but it is by far the most popular, most successful tool. Even today, 1989, the Hilton Perkins program opens, which is now Perkins International, and that serves children with blindness or deafblindness with multiple disabilities all over the world. And this is a photograph that shows Perkins director Edward Waterhouse presenting Helen Keller, the Perkins brailler, in 1953. Next.
So the Samuel P. Hayes Research Library was established in 1880. It is one of the largest collections on the non-medical aspects of blindness. And the archives contain institutional history, collections related to the history of blindness and deafblindness, and a large library of embossed books. The library staff also support the Perkins History Museum, which contains lots of tactile content, braille displays, and audio sound sticks at each topical display. The Perkins Tactile Museum is a collection that supports student learning. There are a lot of things that are too big or too small for kids to touch, according to Director Betsy Sennett. So the museum, things like buildings or a blood cell are too big or too small. She has smaller models built to scale, like the tabletop rendition of the ancient Greek temple known as the Parthenon, and oversized models of microscopic cells that students can take apart and examine. All in all, Perkins is a really special place, and there's always something interesting going on. This is a giant visiting whale that the kids could actually walk inside of. So the Archives program was launched in 2011 when Charlotte Cushman, a former teacher of the blind and visually impaired turned librarian, worked with Perkins research librarian Jan Seymour Ford and administrator Betsy McGinnity to write an NEH grant to process the 19th century collections. I was hired to work on digital projects in the summer of 2011 and before the award was announced, and then had the good fortune of receiving the grant-funded position. From the beginning, the Archives program was rooted in digitization projects. In the first 5 years, we reformatted over 5,000 images and posted them on Flickr with item-level metadata and robust visual descriptions. We also outsourced about 300 texts to the Internet Archive, which had a scanning center nearby at the Boston Public Library. We later purchased a TT Scribe, which is a high-output double-camera imager with a book cradle that facilitated batch scanning manuscript collections. We will talk more about the digital projects later, but first we'll do a deep dive into what makes the archive so special, beginning with the books. As we proceed, please remember that these materials are experienced by touch. This photograph is of Helen Keller reading a tactile map on a trip to the Middle East in 1952. Notice how she is using both hands. Her left pointer is holding her place, and if this was a video, her right finger would be scanning the lines horizontally. A truly defining feature of tactile or embossed books is that they are very big. On the right is Laura Bridgman, who I imagine is having trouble keeping her book from falling off her knees. In our collection, one of our prize items is one of the first copies of the first book for the blind that was printed in Paris in 1786. It was created by Valentine Huet, and it is more a treatise on the problem of accessible literature, but it was created to be read by students who are blind or visually impaired. It feels sort of like a really expensive wedding invitation. It's created with built-up ink, and there's some evidence that a lot of the relief was destroyed in the binding process. So later, the technique shifts to a widely adopted inkless book system that uses a wet process of molding paper with very high relief. This sample is also from the Paris School, and it's from 1817. So we also have samples from across Europe that created a similar style, but with different fonts. This one is from Amsterdam in 1808, and we have many samples from Vienna. The jewel of the collection, however, is the book considered to be the first Braille book. So it's printed in Paris in 1829, containing Louis Braille's code for writing words, music, and plain song and dots. Much of the book is printed in the tactile Roman alphabet with a proposal and charts for using his new code. It's hard to see, but near the top of the right page, the alphabet is missing the letter W, which doesn't have a code because it isn't used in the French language. So this example is the first embossed book printed in the United States by Jacob Snyder in Pennsylvania in 1833. In 1830s Boston, when Samuel Gridley Howe was starting the institution that would become Perkins, by necessity, he had to begin printing his own materials because there was no store to buy them from. He worked with Stephen Preston Ruggles, a skillful printer, to create Boston line type. Boston line type had a number of benefits over the European systems. Namely, the font face was modified to contain fewer unnecessary flourishes, and it maximized the number of words you could fit on a page. So it's much more compact. The book in France also began incorporating these improvements and continued to produce raised Roman type, even though it had been nearly 30 years after Louis Braille had proposed his dot system. So this is 1845. So this kind of enters this in-between phase, which is kind of crazy. So in around 1843, the director of the Paris School banned Braille and burned 73 volumes of books created using the Way and Gilly embossed type. The director was worried that Braille would put the teachers out of business because blind people could read and write on their own, and he disliked the former embossed type because he felt it was inferior to this method used in America. And meanwhile, before Braille is adopted, there's lots of other systems that come out. So this is my favorite. It's called Moon Type. It was invented in 1845. And it is a system that comprised of abstract forms that are derived from capital letters. So you can almost read some of it. The title of this page is John Metcalf. So many of the code really does look like letters that we would recognize. And this made the system much easier to learn amongst adults who were newly visually impaired. It also is a boustrophodon system, which means as the ox turns. So you would start on the left, and when you get to the end of the line, there's that long ellipse, and that guides you to the next line, which you then read backwards or left to right. And so you can continue using one hand instead of two. And this was especially important when there was a rise in adults who had been blinded as part of warfare and maybe also had experienced loss of limbs as part of it. So it's not until 1860 that Braille really arrives to the United States. So Dr. Simon Pollock brought Braille to the Missouri School for the Blind after a trip to Europe. And soon after, William Bell Waite, superintendent of the New York Institution for the Blind, decides to abandon raised print. He tries unsuccessfully to persuade his colleagues in Boston and Philadelphia to adopt the Braille system. So this leads to a rise of multiple dot systems. So English Braille, sometimes called British Braille, is the original Braille code used for the English language with some adaptations like reintroducing the letter W. And then New York Point was a new dot system that was only 2 cells high. So this is an example here. It was sort of like taking Braille and moving it onto its side and removing spaces. So this system was endorsed by the American Association of Instructors for the Blind in 1871. American Braille was created by a piano teacher at Perkins. He sought to assign the fewest dots to the most used letters, making it quicker to read. So this was presented to the American Association of Instructors for the Blind in 1878, but it was rejected because of the recent adaptation of New York Point. So American Braille was really making it work for the English language. In 1905, a uniform type committee was established to deal with the problem of all of these competing systems. So before the adoption of standard Braille, in a letter to William Wade written in 1901, Helen Keller remarks, "There's nothing more absurd, I think, than to have 5 or 6 different prints for the blind." And it's very telling that the seminal work on the history of reading systems for the blind in the United States is titled The War of the Dots. And it introduces the problem by saying, "The conflict was acrimonious in the extreme, the bitterness can hardly be imagined." And that was from the principal of the Overbrook School for the Blind. So an American delegation that successfully brought about the establishment of standard English Braille for all English-speaking countries occurred in London in 1932. So within the span of a single lifetime, to such changes in their reading code as from Boston line type to New York Point to American Braille to revised Braille grade 1.5, and finally from 1.5 to grade 2. What an outcry would be heard in this country if the seeing public had been forced to make a similar series of accommodations. Their virtue, as compared with arbitrary codes, seemed to be that they could be read by sight by the seeing teachers with no special instruction. So it's personal. In a frequently quoted letter to the 1905 Convention of the American Association on Workers for the Blind, Charles Holmes, president of the Perkins Alumni Association, pleaded for the adoption of a uniform code. In order to avail himself of the full range of literature, which at best is woefully limited, the blind reader must learn and keep well up in all these codes, he wrote. How long would our seeing friends stand for such a state of affairs in ink type? Imagine for a moment the ridiculous situation that would arise if the daily papers published in Boston had an entirely different system of characters from those used by New York publishers, and that a Philadelphia man could not read either without special training, because his own city had adopted a third as unlike the other systems as a Chinese character is to a Roman character. And this rose to a subversive use of Braille. So blind pupils in some of the schools, notably in Illinois, used it for personal purposes, but officially it was frowned upon as being a heretical competitor of the Orthodox New York Point, and the appliances for writing it were confiscated by the school authorities. Okay, so the Hall Braille writer was invented in 1892 at the Illinois School for the Blind. Mechanical Braille writers further boost the clear superiority of dot systems. By the time this personal portable machine is available and others like it, Braille becomes the clear winner of the War of the Dots. And in 1932, an official committee of 3 traveled to England with the charge of agreeing upon a uniform code. In the Treaty of London, the adoption of grade 2 was agreed upon. So that's uses contractions as opposed to just each alphabet having a single code. The Library of Congress adopted grade 2 immediately, and it was in use for 80 years. However, a few differences still remained and negotiations continued. English-speaking Braille readers throughout the world continued to hope for a truly uniform Braille code. In 1991, Dr. Cranmer and Dr. Abraham Nemeth began a campaign to further standardize English Braille. A motion to adopt unified English Braille was passed by the Braille Authority of North America in 2012, and the changes will be officially implemented in the United States in 2016. So it's been a long and complicated history. And on top of reading materials, there's also a large collection of tactile graphics, maps, natural history specimens that incorporate a lot of times mixtures of all of these techniques. And there's some interesting inventions along the way, one of them being solid dot Braille, which had the unfortunate characteristic that you could pick off the dots. So there's a legend at Perkins that you were never to read from the choir books because they'd been picked and adulterated to spell crude words. It's also kind of a nightmare for archivists to deal with. You can see how thin and fragile this paper is. Some of the other interesting side effects of all of this experimentation were inventions like gluing 2 pages together so that the embossing can be read both front and back. And that culminated in a book with pages that were so thick that you couldn't bend them.
Okay, right. So before writing, writing before Braille, what we have is square handwriting. So there were pasteboards or metal guides with horizontal grooves that were used to either make the paper crease so that you could feel the lines, or in this case on the left, you would have, you could feel the metal lines placed over the piece of paper. So you would feel that with your fingers. Each letter is produced with the grid formed by the grooves and the left finger. So, next. After the right hand draws the letter, the left forefinger covers it immediately when the pencil moves on to produce the next letter. So you know where you are. A finger's width separates each word. And this system was actually taught well into the 20th century. Obviously, you could write it, but you couldn't read what you had written. So this is an example of Helen Keller's first letter in 1887, and that is squarehand writing. And that is something that Helen Keller, maybe people think that it's her style of writing, but it's actually taught to all students who are blind really for a very long time, especially at Perkins. And this is a wonderful letter Helen writes. And we have a bunch of her early letters on our website. Oh, next. So there are embossed writing systems as well. So we've talked about the embossed reading systems, but there are tools for embossed writing that can be found in our collections, as well as the writing from these tools. So this photograph shows some pocket slates and stylus from France from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Next. And in order to write embossed letters, tools such as this one pictured were used. So this is a writing frame with pinprick sorts. So what you can see is on the left, you have this area where you could put your page down and you would have a grooved guide. And then you have these little blocks, metal blocks with these spikes at the end. And each box has this Roman letter, and you could spell a word, like on this image, it's B-O-X. You would slot those down and you would be making something that looks like the next page, which is pinprick type. So this is a portrait of Julia Brace, who was a deafblind student, and her name is inscribed in pinprick at the bottom of this cabinet card. And it was given as a gift to Laura Bridgman around 1860. And as you can see, it's been worn down by use, by feeling it. It is difficult and time consuming to emboss Roman letters. It is also a lot harder to read, especially after use. Next. So writing in Braille is more efficient, it's easier to read. The tools in this photograph include a stylus for punching the Braille. There's actually an eraser where you can rub out the embossed dot, which is at the far left. There's also tools like this with a board and a slate. So the paper would be placed inside the slate, and you have these little grids that would help you easily make the Braille using your stylus, and it would guide you in these straight lines. And as you can see, there's little slots on each side of the board, so you would know to move down the page evenly. So this is an image of a student using a stylus without the board. Much more efficient. Next. So this is a photograph circa 1896, and it's showing upper school boys in a classroom, and they are working, typing on braillers. A few have slate and styluses, but machines used to type Braille were developed early and made it much easier to write Braille. So this is easy to write, easy to read, very efficient. Next.
So throughout this presentation, we've had lots of images that are the product of our robust digitization program. It was really important, especially to digitize text, because once a flat piece of paper is in the digital environment and you have OCR, then it becomes accessible to users via screen readers. A lot of our programs kind of developed naturally. We were able to do on-demand digitization based on researcher demand, and we used several different platforms to help us. When the program was just starting, we realized that many of our annual reports had already been scanned by the American Printing House for the Blind via the Internet Archive. So that puts publications into a virtual page turning platform with really great search. So the bottom window is our hits to the word brailer. So each of those orange dots shoot you straight to the page where your search term is found. And we also realized that having manuscripts in chronological order that contained a lot of handwritten materials, you could also sometimes get valuable handwritten information just by their being adjacent to text that was searchable. And this is an image of the tabletop scribe, which we purchased so that we could digitize these items in-house instead of sending them, boxing them and sending them across town. We sent a huge amount of very carefully curated scrapbooks that had been pasted into bound volumes with a lot of different topics. It could be specifically to guide dogs, or specifically to adult blind programs, or even topics like restored sight. So all of the stories in the paper where somebody's sight is restored. So this is a example from a set of volumes that specifically relate to the kindergarten for the blind. And sometimes they have very lovely illustrations. And again, even though these are old newspaper with degrading text, you can see that the OCR is actually pretty good. The pop-up window shows the search term for Christmas in the context of the article. Jen and I both have sort of visual arts backgrounds. Jen is a graphic designer, and I took a lot of coursework. And so we came with a good set of skills related to photography and scanning and post-production. And there was a lot of kind of unique methods that we had to come up with to get good images, especially of the books that are printed without ink. So this is an example of staging a volume made in Boston lime type with raking light from the side so that you can get the shadow that allows you to see the relief. So with bright overhead light, it just looks like a blank page. When we were choosing platforms, we were really constrained by resources. We'd been working with Content DM, but that was prohibitively expensive. We looked at maybe using Omeka to host our site, but it was also just, you do kind of need a lot of technical support to launch your own platforms. And so we looked at what the Boston Public Library was doing with Flickr, and this was kind of like on the crest of the Library of Congress successfully using Flickr. And so based on it being, nearly free, we really started building up collections quickly with low cost. So most of the photographs were, reformatted in-house using a flatbed scanner, but then we started using the TT Scribe and sometimes even cross-posting collections that were in the Internet Archive or contributed to Digital Commonwealth, which is the statewide repository for Massachusetts. So sometimes we could pick and choose and kind of curate content differently in Flickr. We have exhibits such as reading and writing methods used by Helen Keller. So we can conceptually chunk together all of the different examples of books for the blind that were used by Helen Keller and sort of have a different entry point to the collections. So this is that set. So it's kind of a virtual bookshelf of Boston Line type, Moon type, New York Point, English Braille, American Braille, and then a little bit on the literature of what we discussed earlier about how hard it was to adopt a single system. So here's an example of a screenshot of the Flickr platform. So it does a good job of kind of dynamically showing sets without having to choose one image and then open up all the metadata record. But we have been sort of beholden to updates and changes to Flickr's platform. So sometimes we get used to having a very large area for text, and then they'll improve the platform and it'll be collapsed into a single line. But overall, it's been a pretty successful place to put a lot of content.
So what does accessibility mean and look like? Making materials accessible to users who are blind, visually impaired, deafblind is a core value that informs all of our digital strategies for the archives. Next. So digital surrogates must be enhanced to be accessible to users who are blind or visually impaired. General accessibility tools are screen readers, which provide audio description of something on a screen, or a refreshable braille display, which provides a tactile description that can be read through touch. So this image on the right is a refreshable braille display, and it will allow somebody to tactily read what is on the screen. Next. So for photographs, we provide descriptions for visual content. Photographs in our collection also includes photographed artifacts, as Molly has shown you. Descriptions begin with generally kind of one informative sentence and then get more detailed. We also think about, consider historical and cultural context. We just finished a project over this pandemic to really standardize and improve our image descriptions. And we worked actually with Perkins Access to try to provide an example of what archival descriptions can and should look like. And as you can see, they're big, they're a lot of work, but I think with a lot of our work that we've done for accessibility, it's kind of a win-win situation because it provides wonderful search opportunities. It's very helpful for sighted and non-sighted users. Next. So for manuscripts and handwritten correspondence, we provide transcriptions and descriptions. So descriptions might include a brief overview. This is just letting a user know that this is part of a letter that Anne Sullivan wrote to Michael and Agnes asking for some supplies to help teach Helen in Alabama. So that we also will provide the full text of that, that letter. Next. So for audiovisual, we recently finished a pilot project where we digitized a Perkins produced film called Deafblind Circus from 1969. That is a delight to watch and is available on our website. And for this, there is closed captioning for the audio, but there's also audio descriptions to provide more access to what is happening in the film. And there's a downloaded transcript of the audio and audio description. So this is an example of a film that is accessible to people with blindness, deafblindness, and provides multiple ways of accessing information. Next. So we rely heavily on OCR for our annual report collections, correspondence collections, and scrapbooks, as Molly touched on. This provides enough text searchability that this content is accessed quickly. I think between the other archivist and the research librarian, we use this almost a daily basis to get information. Next. We use transcriptions and description that might include, for embossed text, books and texts, that might include a visual description and a transcription. And in this case, this is, as Molly talked about, this first Braille book in 1829, Proposing Braille. So it has a little bit of a description to note that there is some flourishes. There's also a transcription in French, as well as a translation in English. Next. So Susanna Coit is the other archivist at Perkins, and she manages the archive social media and has been very successful at engaging our Instagram users. Next. She provides a general overview of the image, her message. Can be a lot of fun. In this case, she's talking about a friendship between Elizabeth Robin and Edith Thomas, who are good friends, and they're in the deafblind program. And they have been described as having flying fingers when they get together because they're so happy to see each other. So this is a post that's supposed to drive, hopefully, users to the blog post about their friendship. And so there's that little brief message at the top, but then there's an image description below and then the hashtags. And so that's how we make the Instagrams posts accessible. For our newsletters. And for all images, we have alt text, but we enhance many of our photos with captions, with long descriptions in our captions. Next. So transcriptions provide access to handwriting and embossed books, but we can't and don't provide it for everything. We are a small operation. We are one in a full-time archivist and an almost full-time archivist, and we don't have the resources, the time to do as much as we would like, but we found that being able to provide enough information that somebody knows we have it allows us to then provide on demand for researchers who are blind or visually impaired, and we've done that. And so that's kind of our compromise, but we do work very hard to make sure as much as possible is transcribed. And sometimes that we put it up and that happens later on. Next. A transcription project that provided access to handwritten indices in our correspondence collection that spans 1828 to 1920 allows sighted and non-sighted users to easily search by name, by correspondence. So this image shows a page of the index, and on the right is a list of the names that had been transcribed in the page numbers, and that's available on the Internet Archive metadata page. And that's what the page would look like on the Internet Archive. Next. And then we also provided that on our website. So we have this transcribed indices with the names, with the page numbers. We have a link to the online digitized version. But we also have added or enhanced it with links to correspondence. There's many really interesting people that were corresponding during this time. And we tried to add those in hopes that other people will be interested in them or know that that is the actual important person they think it is. And so that's kind of an added value, but that's how we kind of manage this handwritten, hard to read, un-OCRable text on the right by having that accessed by the correspondent. Next. So the Nella Brady Honey collection is a manuscript collection that contains 15 boxes of correspondence that are digitized and available on the Internet Archive. Most are handwritten correspondence that's been transcribed and is in the process of being added to Flickr. So 2 boxes are available now, and to give you some idea, that's 900 letters, notes, postcards, little scraps of paper. Next. And this is, oh, sorry, back. It's a tricky because it's the same slide. This is really significant because the collection documents the activities of Helen Keller later in life. It's her travels, it's her activism, it's information about after Anne Sullivan had passed away. It's information that was forwarded to Henny for a book she was writing that was published about Sullivan in 1933. So it's an extremely important collection. The woman on the left in this photo is Nella Brady Henny. Helen Keller is the one laughing in the middle. And to her left and to our right is Polly Thompson. So Keller's companion and interpreter following Sullivan's death in 1936. So, however, next. Polly Thompson had very, very difficult to read handwriting. It looks legible, but if you get close, it starts to become very illegible very quickly. She often breaks words into multiple words. So it's really one word, but it looks like 3 or 4 words. She uses Scottish terms that have gone out of vogue many years ago. She writes on sideways. She writes on all kinds of materials. She likes to, be, I guess, thrifty with the writing materials. There's actually a letter in the collection talking about her needing to resend a letter that is more legible if that person is expected to read it. So in short, it really is inaccessible, a huge amount of this collection to sighted researchers because of this handwriting. So this is not, I couldn't find the worst example, but this is a good example where it seems legible, but every once in a while you look at a word like the word right, which is the last word before P, and that does not look anything like what I would interpret as right. Which brings me next to Larry and Sue Melander. So not only did they transcribe all the correspondence indices, which took years, they have transcribed most of the handwritten collection in the Nellie Honey collection. So this has taken years. This was an enormous task that required patience and perseverance. And it started out as just the highlights because we weren't going to do everything. But I think they just loved the riddle and they got good at it and they kind of cracked that code that was her writing. And they spent an enormous amount of time transcribing that material. They have been volunteers since 2012. And Larry has worked at Perkins. He worked there for 30 years. So to have that kind of experience and knowledge and just dedication to come in every week and be able to get to know that collection and both of those collections was just a wonderful gift for us. And then another employee, Jamie Gordon, a former employee, she's been volunteering since 2017, and she's actually been adding those to Flickr, which is its own painstaking process because, you know, providing that really kind of jumbled correspondence on a Flickr page it was hard to do every day. And so having a volunteer come in also to do that has been enormously helpful and has made a lot available on Flickr. So before the pandemic, the Landers actually had finished that and had started transcribing the early correspondence of our friend Laura Bridgman. Next. And this is a sample of her writing, which is squarehand. It's a little harder to read as Bridgman gets older. She also tends to write long letters, and by the end she's exhausted and it becomes very difficult to read. So it's a lot easier than probably the Henny collection, but they've found their own challenges with this. But what's wonderful about this is, you know, she was incredibly famous in her time, and just having names and having little tidbits that you could pull out easily by having it transcribed will be really, really helpful and just provide more access. So really for us, utilizing OCR, transcriptions, descriptions, provide access to our materials. They make them more findable, they make them more easy to navigate, and it really allowed us to make more information available to researchers of all abilities, backgrounds, ages. It just opens up more possibilities for access. And that includes us who are working with the materials and trying to help people answer the questions. Next. So I'll just end with this cabinet card of Helen Keller as a young girl reading in about 1888. And we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you both so much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and you know, the conference theme is representation recovery, and I think you really sort of illustrate really critical points about so much of that work begins with accessibility, availability, findability, and I really think you nicely sort of illustrate sort of a really rich intersection of scholarly editing and archival practice. And so thank you so much, and we look forward to the discussion. We're fortunate we have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So so please don't hesitate to enter any questions that you have into the question box. So we'll begin with a question from Noelle Baker, and I'll read out the questions. I learned so much from this session. I'm interested in your core value, informed by accessibility, and the different kinds of displays that uphold it. Can you talk a bit more about best practices for archival descriptions governed by accessibility?
Sure. So we actually just finished working with Perkins Access to make sure that we were describing our images as they should be, but also trying to manage that with the archival description component. And what we realized was most of it was the same. Generally, we're making longer descriptions. So when you do an accessible description, you want to start out with the simple, kind of a basic summary, and then go down into specifics of what's most important. And so for us, we want to make sure that we we can't include everything, but we want to try to capture most of what's in there and really think about the historical context. And so I would say any kind of image description, I guess guidance is generally going to work for that, but just make sure to add any kind of relevant, I guess, context. Does that make sense?
One of the things that I've always taken with me from what I learned at Perkins is that when you do a visual description of a photograph, you should focus on what the purpose of the photograph is. So, you know, is it, you know, just to show what the person looks like, or is it a picture of them with their hands up going like, look how fun this place we're in is. So instead of saying, you know, they're wearing a lace collar, they're, you know, this isn't that, depending on the situation, you know, that might not really be relevant. So to talk a little bit more about like the best practices for archival descriptions, you know, since leaving Perkins, the institutions that I've been at since have, you know, never had an image description be part of their structured metadata. And we discovered that when we migrated the metadata into Digital Commonwealth, for example, we were in a fielded system with very specific categories, right? And so a lot of what we were doing was all kind of merged into one big description box instead of having a completely separate field for that. And, you know, that's sort of interesting of, you know, how it's kind of a unique thing that we do that doesn't necessarily fit into larger systems. And when we're building all this up in Flickr, luckily there wasn't a character limit in their description box. So we kind of had to create dummy fields within that one big box that were separated by, you know, visual line breaks and bolded font, which isn't ideal. When you're working with a screen reader and you're tabbing through, it's not going to pick up that those are different sections. And that's sort of interesting. And then I just wanted to make one other comment about learning a little bit more about documentary editing, how important it is for the interpretation to be part of description in your field. Whereas a lot of times I think of metadata and archival description as being just the facts and not bringing in the interpretation, because for us, that's the researcher's job.
Thank you very much. And I have there's a follow-up question sort of related to your comments on describing photographs. Are there images that are uncomfortable to describe? Does sensitivity come into play at times?
Absolutely. A lot of our pictures are children. So there's considerations there. There's definitely other, you know, racial insensitivity things that are definitely in our collection. So we want to make sure, and that's something we're reevaluating now, that we can't really hide something and warn somebody. So it's kind of a discussion of, do we put it up, or how do we let somebody know that we have it if we haven't put it up, or do we provide some sort of warning? We absolutely do have those images, probably along with everybody else. And we are kind of wrangling with that, and especially with children, because a lot of these, you know, students are posed in a particular way to convey what they're doing. So absolutely. And maybe just to add to that, I think one thing that dictates what we do, photographs or otherwise, is that we're still a school. And so I think being sensitive to a student 100 years ago is being sensitive to a parent today, and making sure that if something is upsetting to somebody, we take it off or acknowledge it or deal with that. Because It's really, even though it's a long time ago, it's not.
Thank you very much. And sort of while we're along sort of this line of description, if I might ask a brief follow-up, I'm curious, you sort of nicely articulated sort of the challenges of archival work in terms of the limits of time and the amount to be described and transcribed. I'm curious if you would describe how do you set priorities, and sort of that spectrum of significance, what you're going to, perhaps create a richer description for, or sort of prioritize in terms of making available, online. I'm just sort of curious in terms of what does that practice sort of look like at Perkins? And
I guess it's kind of an evolution. I think it depends on how. I think now when we put something up, we take a longer amount of time to do it. If it's more, I guess like the Helen Keller stuff maybe gets more attention, something that we know somebody will get more attention, we'll do that with. It's also this ongoing process, because every time I go to an image, I know more about that image, because a lot of them are used in publications, or you just get to know more about it. So then you're constantly adding more to those descriptions. We have some that are very short, we have some that are very long. We're working on standardizing those, but it's so overwhelming that I think when you find out more about something and you can easily go back and just add to it, that's probably the biggest way. I don't know, Molly.
I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if somebody's using, or we know they're using something a lot, or we want them to be using something because it's very important, like the Nellie Brady Henny, we would focus more on that.
thank you very much. Another question from our participants. It is wonderful that you can provide sufficient information for researchers who are visually impaired or blind to conduct their own research. Are there any such research projects that you'd like to amplify?
No, but I can't think of something off the top of my head, but I will say that I had kind of a nice experience with somebody who was writing their PhD. They wanted access to something which required transcription. And I really struggled because it was so hard to read, and I had to put in so many brackets, and I thought, like, I just felt absolutely horrible about it. I showed it to multiple people, and we tried our best to provide accurate, transcription of this correspondence and handwriting. And I felt awful, but I emailed back to him, I explained everything, and just profusely apologized because I felt like I was inhibiting his research. And he sent me this funny antidote that was in a book, and it was about a teacher being handed a note from him. He was a teacher, and they were basically like, you need to write this legibly, or like go back and he was like the head of the school at the time, get that person to write this legibly. And he laughed about it, and I laughed about it, and it made me realize that I think we're so worried about like not doing good enough or offending somebody that we don't do anything. And I think it's an important lesson that like that's access, like providing that is helpful. And we can do that. And especially for stuff that isn't accessible now, we want to make sure people understand that we will provide as best access as we can.
Thank you very much. We have a question related to the War of Dots, and the question is, why did the War of Dots become so personal and so acrimonious?
Well, think about how personal it is to be able to read what you want to read, and how infuriating it would be to not have what you need in the system that is preferred. So I think when Helen Keller was taking her Radcliffe exams, there were two different systems, and there was some issue about, the fairness of having to, switch up how you're reading and responding to those questions. And if you have a personal preference for one system and you're forced to use a different one, I think that's personal, and those discussions were acrimonious. They were combative, and yeah.
Thank you very much. This next question is related to accessibility. I thought, sort of a, interesting aspect of your talk was sort of the idea of sort of how ideas of accessibility sort of inform the descriptive practices, the practices of making content available online. The questions related to how do those standards sort of emerge within the institution? Sort of how is sort of have ideas and definitions of what accessibility means, have those shifted over time?
Absolutely, they have. I think the beginning of the school, that the idea was to provide an education, that these are going to be students who grow up into adults that are going to have jobs. And that was a big deal. But I think, when you have things like where are the dots, where if a teacher can't read something, well, that's like, they decide not to use braille. And I think that evolution of design is really interesting. How did Bots Online type? Because he thought of it almost as universal access, right? Like a teacher can read it, a student can read it, which is a concept today that is kind of in and out, where the idea is that we shouldn't make something an accessible version, it should all be accessible. But then it gets really complicated, because what is accessibility to one person versus somebody else, and it becomes much more complicated. It's a discussion that happens now. It's happened ever since it started. And it does get very personal. People have very personal preferences about how they access information and how it's provided to them. And having multiple choices in how you get information is something that we do now and try to provide. I think that's something then that was more, it wasn't as big of a thing, because they wanted everybody kind of standardized doing the same thing. So that when things change to make things more specialized to a student, I think is when things kind of appeared more as they are now, more individualized. But it definitely still changes.
And accessibility is, tied to technology, and technology is always shifting. So there's no one solution. It's always going to be changing to keep up with technology, So if you adjust your website and you get it just to where you want it, and then your Drupal is upgraded, you have to start again, technology is, the best friend of many individuals who are blind. And, the inclusion of accessibility features baked into the Apple system in the early days made it the absolute clear choice versus Android. So things like that are just constantly changing.
Thank you very much. And as a follow-up, you're in your discussion, you really sort of highlight sort of that history of technological changes related to accessibility technology, but sort of in your working practice, what do you view as still sort of significant, challenges? Whether with, I think the image of sort of you illuminating the object from the side, I think is striking sort of challenges in digitizing content, but also uses of screen readers and sort of other technology to sort of support, engagement with the digitized objects. What are some of the significant hurdles that still remain where there's sort of need for more innovation?
Do you mean more technology, or just, one of the problems I have is that a lot of our materials were made, they were either handmade or we just don't know where they were. And I can't look up and find information about what this thing is. So it's hard to provide access to something, it's one of those things where you're describing, in a way, it's nice to have that description, because you can describe what it looks like. And hopefully that helps somebody think about what it could possibly be used for, but we would have no idea, or we're using clues and we can't say for absolute certainty, but we'd have to say this might be used for, and try to back that up with something, which is not something we want to do as archivists. So it gets really tricky. That's the challenge that I come into a lot in this archive, is materials that I don't know what they are necessarily, or how they might have been used. It's this long process of trying to figure that out. And then in terms of technology, I think Molly and I had talked about how somebody had developed software for OCR to OCR Braille. And I was told that it didn't take because it wasn't accurate enough to make it affected. Like you would have, the time you spent correcting it just made it pointless. So that was an interesting kind of innovation that just didn't really work. And something to think about with that is that Braille is often on two sides of a piece of paper. So it could be really hard to image what that would look like, because it's hard to read visually. It's very hard to read, or it's been worn down by somebody's use, which makes it really difficult. Or it's not, Braille isn't just Braille, it's all those different, types of Braille or languages. We've had problems where something was in a different language, we finally figured out, or upside down. So it can get really tricky in that way too.
Yeah, and for a long time, Braille materials, weren't considered preservation copies. So it's, in a way, it's consumable. The more you read it, the more it's worn down. And so there's kind of very little scholarship on especially at national levels, on the preservation of Braille materials, because they weren't expected to be forever. And then I wanted to make a comment about a completely different kind of accessibility, which is, the level for which you use your writing based on somebody's cognitive abilities. So if you want to make materials and descriptions accessible to younger children or adults with cognitive disabilities, you wouldn't use words like acrimonious. So that's an entire different kind of accessibility that one might think about.
Thank you very much. Oh, and Jen, we have a follow-up to your comment related to materials where it's difficult to hypothesize or identify their use. Anecdotally, can you describe one such artifact that you struggle to imagine its use, or where you haven't been able to sort of identify what it is?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's usually some kind of, I think there's usually some kind of writing tool. Sometimes it's just a wooden thing that I don't know what it was. Like it's molded or shaped in a certain way, but it's just not obvious. It's not like a ball or a square. Oh man, that's a great question. I wish I could think of something.
You always need subject experts alongside you. Like, for example, we don't read Braille. And so if we're to describe something that isn't published and we have the translation, we wouldn't be able to read the Braille ourselves. And one little fun fact. The directors of Perkins were all very invested in the Greek cause. Samuel Gridley Howe went and fought in the Battle of Greek Independence. And one of the major reasons why Braille was preferable is because you couldn't do Boston line type in the Greek language. And so in order to get Greek texts, you had to make that transition to Braille.
I did think of a strange object. It did have a little information with it, which is the only reason we would know what it was, but it's this board, and Molly, you know what I'm thinking. It's like these nails. Somebody developed a system where they would bend these little tiny like tacks or nails that would be in a shape, and that would be the alphabet. So it was this, it looked just like somebody was in the backyard just hammering and bending nails, but it was a system that somebody developed to write. So there was even homemade systems that people would use probably in rural areas, just to communicate or come up with something new. And that is an object that we have online in our digital collection on Flickr. That's really interesting. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat.
I think to further complicate that object, I think it was in the Armenian language. Watertown, Massachusetts has the second largest Armenian population. And I believe that alphabet board might have been in some way created for the Armenian language.
Thank you very much. We're unfortunately at time, but I would like to, so we'll have to stop our discussion at this point. But first, I would like to thank you so much to our panelists, Jen Hale and Molly Stothert-Maurer, for sharing your work with us today. In a very interesting and compelling case study with a really interesting discussion of issues related to accessibility the digitization and representation of unique texts, and really how we support those relationships with readers and objects in sustaining ways. So thank you so much, and thank you for all of you for attending this afternoon session of the 2021 Association for Documentary Editing annual meeting.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you can email either of us if you would like the image. I can't find it right now. Thank you so much.